I am thrilled to be here today with Dr. Paula Boddington, and her specialty is AI and the philosophy of AI. And just as a little introduction, Dr. Boddington has held academic positions at the University of Bristol, the Australian National University, Cardiff University, and Oxford. And she's received research awards from the Future of Life Institute, the National Institute of Health Research, and the Wellcome Trust. And I know that a lot of her research has focused on applied philosophy and artificial intelligence, data ethics. And I'm going to let her talk more about what it is that she actually does so that we can get started. But our basic topic today is going to be Paula's background and life, and also some of her work in AI and how that fits in. And maybe at some point we'll get talking about creativity. Maybe that's the last thing we have left with that AI can't really get at. I mean, they think they can get at it, but maybe they can't really. So Paula, is it okay if I call you Paula?
Of course, yeah, of course.
Okay. I usually start off in my channel with having my guests tell me about their life and how they kind of got started in life, and then how they kind of got interested in this little corner of the internet. And I'm very curious about how you ended up on Jonathan Pajot's channel,
okay,
given your background and everything. So if you could kind of start with your childhood and then bring us up to date, sort of, that'd be great.
Okay, great. Thanks for the introduction. Yes, so actually, in terms of creativity, because I was going to talk to you, I was thinking quite a lot about creativity, and not so much in terms of how AI might be creative, because I tend to think it can't be, that humans are creative. But I was thinking about it in terms of, so a lot of my career, I've been teaching ethics with students. And in fact, so I've been working over the last 5 or 6 years in mostly the ethics of artificial intelligence. And how I work is not so much me saying what I think is ethical or not, but just exploring the area and more kind of facilitating how people might think about it. So the topic of creativity really and open-mindedness comes into that an awful lot, actually. So from a point of view how somebody might approach even noticing that there's a problem, or how we might go about thinking about it. So, but I'll start off by introducing myself in the way your guests often do, by just like a potted summary.
Yeah.
So, tell me if I'm talking too much or going into too much detail.
Oh, no, we love talking.
Okay, so I was born and brought up in London and around London, but both my parents came to London separately from South Wales. They both come from Cardiff, and my father was an engineer who then in his 30s went back and retrained as a teacher. And I kind of mentioned that. So the background for that is actually really quite important to my life, because people from America won't necessarily be familiar with the geography of it. So Wales is actually quite different from England. It's terribly close. It's like you could cram them both in really, really close in American terms. Mm-hmm. But South Wales, it was a really heavy industrial area. Cardiff was a major port, and actually, so both my parents came from backgrounds where, I mean, my mother's background was more working class than my father's, but it came from backgrounds where there was quite a lot of work around, except at certain points, like during the Depression, where there was a lot of unemployment, but a lot of really heavy industry, a lot of really, really hard work. So I've got a great grandfather who was a coal miner, and they worked in heavy industry. Mm. But there's always been a long tradition of getting education, because it's your ticket out. Mm. So my father becoming a school teacher, and his mother was a school teacher, and one of his brothers was a school teacher. So his mother became, I say this because it's kind of relevant to my whole attitude towards education and its possibilities. And partly I say this because I don't know if it's the same in America. There's grown up this idea that the working classes aren't interested in education and can't be educated, which is such anathema to the whole of my background. So my father's mother was, because there's long gaps between the generations in our family. So because they tend to have children late. So I think we must be closer to the primeval swamp. We must be evolving much more slowly. So she was born the illegitimate daughter of a Victorian barmaid, and was brought up by, we're not quite sure what relatives in Cardiff. and went to teacher training college and ended up being the headmistress of girls' grammar school. So that kind of like sets something, I suppose, like kind of really important. But it was like we had get an education kind of whispered into our ears from the cradle onwards. And then something else really important was that, oh, actually, so I'll just tell a little incident, because I often think about this in terms of how I came to be thinking about the world in the way I am. And of course, who knows? How can we possibly understand ourselves? But
Yes.
who knows? But something which was a really formative experience. I was 6 years old, because I could remember the teacher. And you know how when I've always loved painting and drawing. I've always done a lot of that. So you know how little children, when they're first like drawing an outside scene with the houses and the trees and the hills and the sky is like a thin blue line at the top of the page, and then there's a white blank, and then there's the trees and stuff like that. I had this big argument with all the kids in my class. I said, no, the sky goes all the way down to the trees. And I can remember to this day pointing out of a window in frustration, look, the sky touches the trees. And then nobody would listen to me. And I can remember running home. We used to run home along the road together. And I remember shouting and pointing, look, the sky touches the trees. And they took no notice. But then the following week in art class, the teacher stood in front of the class and said, now listen, children, when you paint the sky, make the blue go all the way down, so there's no white gap, because the blue goes all the way down to the trees and the hills. And they all started doing it. And I had this revelation that the only reason why we did it was because she was the teacher, not because of what they could see with their own eyes. So that kind of like really, really sunk in about the authority of the teacher, and of how it's only because she told them that they believed it. So I really remember that.
Well, to me, that says something about your perspective on the world, because my immediate thought, and this tells you something about me, my immediate thought when you told me what the teacher did, my immediate thought was, oh, wow, Paula was vindicated. So I was thinking more in terms of if I were you, I would think, oh, I'm vindicated. I wouldn't be thinking they're listening because she's the teacher. So you learned something very valuable out of that, and I would have learned nothing except massaging my own ego.
Well, I knew I was right because I could see it with my own eyes. But it's actually interesting to see, because it's really interesting in terms of, see, because a lot of the work I do, a lot of the work in teaching is about moving people's perspectives, and also in philosophy. Like, so one of the first texts that you read in philosophy very often is Descartes' discourse on the method and meditations, where he's going through doubting what we can see. So, but on the one hand, I could see with my own eyes how the sky related to the trees. But on the other hand, I've worn glasses since I was really tiny. So I always knew that when I took my glasses off, the world doesn't go fuzzy. So I always, I knew it was like how I perceive the world, not the world. You don't think everything goes soft because you're taking your glasses off. So I think I've always, so like from quite a young age, I had a kind of perspective that maybe that's why I ended up being a philosopher, because you always had that idea about what can you know, and why do you know it?
Yeah, you were a very deep thinker, because I didn't get glasses until I was 13, but already, I mean, I hadn't been able to see for some years, but nobody noticed it until a math teacher when I was 13. And I was sitting in the back of the class, and he kept asking me questions, and the screen was, I mean, the blackboard was just a big blur to me. I didn't know what he was talking about. And finally, he went and talked to my parents, and he said, I think she needs glasses. Yes. And all of a sudden, the trees went from just being these blobs to actually having leaves and things that I didn't even know were there. Yes. So I wasn't giving any thought to it. It didn't have any meaning to me. You thought about it, and to you, it had this deep meaning. So yes, you're a philosopher.
And something else, which is actually quite comical to look back. We had a teacher, Mr. Needs, who used to take us, he wasn't our main teacher, he used to take us swimming, and he used to take us for music. And he was like one of these real dedicated teachers. And he used to love telling us things that we couldn't really possibly understand. And I remember I must have been about 8. He told us about somebody who'd produced a mathematical proof for the existence of God. So I was completely fascinated by this. And about the time we were doing like series in maths, like 2, 4, 6, 8, and so on, and we came up with the idea of infinity, and I knew that God was infinite. So I had this idea went home and I had this idea that if only I could find the right kind of series that would somehow end in infinity, that would be a proof that God existed. So I spent hours and hours and hours up in our attic trying different ways of trying to prove the existence of God, which you'll have to wait for my forthcoming book to find out if I managed to prove. I just diverted into kind of like working out quick ways of adding up and so on. But I was really fascinated with that idea. So
Yeah. You were saying that during your growing up years, it was important to you to get an education, and that was partly because your father was a teacher.
Yes,
or were both your parents teachers? Just your father?
Just my father. Yeah. So yeah. So in terms of, and also I think it's got really important to my outlook. The things that we were taught, some things are quite foundational. They just stay with you forever, don't they? So I think it's we are sort of when I say we, it's funny how I always think of my childhood in the plural. I mean, I think about those particular incidents, but I always think when everyone said what you do as a child, I would end up saying we, because I'm the middle of three. I've got an elder sister and a younger brother. And we all went to the school where my father taught, which was a grammar school. So just to explain that for international audiences, it was, now it's mostly the case that state schools are comprehensive, they'll take anybody. But at the time, it was standard that a grammar school was academically selective school, a free state school, but academically selective. But my father taught, he taught woodwork and technical drawing and metalwork, but we always thought of him as a woodwork teacher. So he taught woodwork at an academically selective school, which was significant in lots of ways, partly because he was a bit of an outsider. If you teach woodwork, you don't have to go into the staff room because you can make your own tea. And and also there were some teachers there who were really academically snobby. So because he was a woodwork teacher, they treated him like he was the handyman. And I remember him telling us about some teachers who really looked down on woodwork as being something that didn't involve intelligence and that anybody could do it. So Dad would be kind of bristling with indignation about this because it just obviously is not true. It's just obviously not true. It involves all sorts of things. And also, like, the woodwork teachers are usually quite popular. But it's interesting because his explanation for that is not just because people like woodwork, but because you have to have absolute discipline in the classroom because you're very sharp tools there. And the kids actually thrive on knowing exactly where they are and knowing discipline.
Wow, that's really fascinating. Yeah, that's fascinating.
Yeah, and you used to get like quite a lot of, sorry, this is a bit of a sidetrack, but you used to get quite a lot of like the naughty boys who would like to gravitate towards doing woodwork. And so, for example, he ran a club for boys who'd been found pinching cars and joyriding. He ran a motor mechanics club so that they could get out their interesting cars by learning how to fix engines. And some of them were too young to drive. One of them, some little kid who was 14 and short for his age. He stole a car and drove it all the way to Brighton from London. It's about 60 miles before the police caught up with him. He could hardly see above the steering wheel. So there were some naughty boys, but he channeled that with, who knows what success, into doing something that was actually constructive, learning how to fix motors. So yeah. So that was,
thank God for teachers like that. Really.
Anyway, but he always impressed on us. And I do think this affected quite a lot about how my more recent work in AI and technology. He really impressed on us the importance of understanding the materials that you're working with and the importance of understanding the tools that you're using. So, and that I just think that kind of like physical understanding of the world around you, what stuff is made of, and what the properties of the material you're using have got and what you can work with. So I always remember him talking about going with the grain. But it's interesting because now I think a lot of people wouldn't even know what going with the grain meant in terms of following the grain of the wood. And in terms of talking about the use of tools, he always used to say, if you use tools properly, you hardly ever need to use force. It doesn't involve force, but sometimes brute force is the only thing that will will work. So actually, so I brought this to show you. This is his. Can you see this? This is one of his carpenter's pincers.
Mm-hmm.
I just brought this because it's one of my favourite tools, because I can remember him being a kid and explaining to us why it's curved, as to how you use it to avoid force. Because when you're pulling out a nail, you just put it down like that, and you don't pull, you just roll. You just roll it and it pulls the nail up. So it's that kind of stuff got really impressed on me. And I'm kind of leaping forward to the work I'm doing now on AI and technology. One of the key things that people are concerned about with ethical issues in AI is what's become known as transparency. About transparency being whether we can understand exactly what the AI is doing, and if we can understand exactly how it's operating, or if we can explain it. But it really strikes me that there's all sorts of things that we use that people have got no idea. People have got no idea how they work. Even in really everyday objects, they have got no idea. They've got no idea where, really simple, really kind of simple things around us. So I kind of think that connection with understanding the world around us is something that we can really easily, rapidly lose.
Well, the thing that popped into my mind is this old story, and I don't know if it's apocryphal or if it really happened, but it's the story of this woman that every time she would make a roast, she would cut both ends off the roast, and then she'd put it in her pan and roast it. And finally, one day, her husband asked her, why do you do that?
Yes.
She said, I don't know. My mother always did it that way. So that's the way I do it. So she finally went back and she asked her mother, and she said, Mother, why do you cut both ends off the roast before you roast it? And she said, well, that's the only way I could fit it in the pan that I had.
Yeah,
I mean, we have these things that have been around so long. We learn something. You know, you said one of the things you said was you learn something once that's very foundational and you never forget it. There's a good side to that and a bad side to that, because some people learn something early on and they hold on to it the rest of their lives, but they don't know why they do it, and there's not a good reason for doing what they do, but they do it anyway.
Yes, that is really important, actually, because I think one of the things when we're thinking about technology now, I think that's one of the reasons why it's actually really important to talk to different people and to talk to older people, because stuff is changing so rapidly. But we completely forget things that we knew a while ago. So, for example, I've been doing this for years, actually. I often encourage students to actually try planning out their essays on bits of paper, just simply because they might find that their ideas are going to flow in a different way if they've got a big piece of paper in front of them, and if they've got a screen where you can just see a little bit at a time. But those kinds of things, you just assume that you have to get a Word document, so I just think it's really important to think about different, how we're doing things can really constrain us.
Well, I have a 26-year-old daughter, and one of the things I've noticed in her generation the last maybe 10 years or so is the interest that they've taken in the old wives' tales, the things that our mothers always taught us.
Yes.
That I never even thought to teach her, because now we have technology that takes care of those things. But in her generation, they're going back to these old ways, and they're instituting them, and they're learning, different ways of cleaning, different ways of taking care of things that were things that older generations did without thinking, because that's what they had learned from their parents.
Yeah.
But we've forgotten it because we let our tools do it for us now, right?
It's really interesting. So a lot of the things that people are talking about now in terms of sustainability and the environment and recycling was stuff that people did in the past out of, I was in the Girl Guides, and there was a badge you could do called thrift, like make, do and mend. People did it in the past just because they didn't have resources, or because it took a long time to recover after the war and so on. And then the idea of thrift went out, because that was kind of like just being a bit shabby. And now it's back in again.
I still remember putting the light bulb inside the sock and weaving the thread back and forth, mending the socks. I mean, that was one of my jobs when I was a kid.
Yes, yeah. It's quite satisfying, isn't it? I love darning.
Except nowadays, I mean, socks are so cheap. They make them in China, and you just throw them out when they get a hole in them. And
Yep. Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
you're going to school at your father's school, and somehow your interest kind of gravitates towards philosophy. And is that what you went into in college then, or?
Okay, I actually didn't really like school very much, because when we had, for the first couple of years we'd been living in a different part of London, and I'd gone to an all-girls school, and we moved and went to a mixed school. And I don't really want to dwell on it, but I had a really terrible time. I was bullied really badly by the boys, actually. So I used to, I had a really unhappy time at school. So I used to miss a lot of school. The school was, in many ways, the school was really, really brilliant in terms of its attitude towards education, compared to some of the things I'm concerned about with students now, actually. But in many ways, it was terrible. It was a terrible school in other ways. I mean, like, the headmaster ran off with one of the girls in my year. That'll
Oh
give you,
no.
that'll give you an idea. That'll give you an idea. And I used to miss a lot of school. So I used to miss a lot of school and just kind of like just wander up to the central London and poke around in secondhand bookshops, or go to the library. I used to go to the local library and kind of take out lots of philosophy books and read philosophy. But I did mostly science. In the last 2 years of school in the UK, you specialise an awful lot. So I did mostly science. I did physics, chemistry, and biology in my last 3 years, because I loved science. I particularly loved physics.
Mhm.
But so I got to backtrack a bit now, because I want to talk about what I really liked about the attitude towards education in the school.
Mhm.
So it was a grammar school, so academically selective, but also it was a particularly good grammar school, so it had really good results. And there were lots of changes afoot, some of them not so great, but some of them were really good. So there was a real emphasis on learning for its own sake. So, and we did lots of stuff that wasn't actually in the curriculum. And in fact, the school, this would never happen now. I presume it's similar in America to here. The school boasted that the A levels are the exams you take at the end of school, but the qualifications to get into university. The school boasted that their A level results were lower than they used to be, because they said that was proof that the students were having a better education and focusing on things outside the curriculum. You couldn't possibly get away with that. So things we did. So every single week in the sixth form was the last 2 years of school. I went as a group of about 10 or 12 of us. The head of a sixth form took us up to the Tate Gallery, and we had talks about modern art from somebody who must have been the head of the Tate, or head of the, he must have known him. I don't know how he managed it. Nothing to do with anything I was studying. Every single week we went up to the Tate Gallery and had private lectures.
Wow.
It was just a free state school. It was
Huh.
just unbelievable. So the idea that you just had to, so students were still getting into university or doing whatever they wanted to do, but the idea that they were pleased that people weren't focusing just on academic performance. So that was kind of like really something, really. I think it's, I mean, if there are any younger people listening, I really, it just, the focusing on exams, grades is just terrible. It's just terrible for actually thinking, and not to mention the pressure it puts on people.
So have you kept in touch with any of the other people that you were in that sixth form with, to know what they did with their lives with that
Yes,
opportunity?
yes. So I've got a friend who's actually moved to California many years ago. She became a biochemist. She was
Uh-huh.
she was the other girl who did uh, all the same classes as me. And another friend, Margaret, who her father was also a teacher. He was an art teacher. She's an artist, so we've been friends ever since. So yeah, another girl who was one of the first women to work in a city, I think, doing a different kind of life. I haven't kept in touch with like millions of them, but
Mhm.
yeah. So
So it sounds like it was a successful,
yes, and another friend who became a psychiatrist. So yeah, and
yeah, very successful move by the school.
and somebody else who was a journalist, and yeah, so it was a successful school, I think. So I because I was so disaffected, I was like kind of a bit of a disaffected teenager, really. I didn't apply for university when I was at school. I went out to work first of all. And actually, I'll just mention that really briefly, because I've often thought of the work I did. I went and worked as a lab technician for Ilford Films, which is a photographic company, and I was working in the physics research department as a technician working on. We were doing research on psychophysics, which is looking at, we're developing, like old-fashioned emulsion film, because that's all there was in those days,
Mhm.
working on developing a very fast film which had a problem that it would, the photos would come out very grainy. So really, really great, a lot of graininess, and in particular at certain densities, certain shades of grey were much grainier than others. So the psychophysics research was doing it for the equipment, the objective measures of how grainy it was were different from subjective in terms of how people perceived it. So we were doing experiments trying to correlate how people saw how grainy the photos were with how much the machine measured it. So again, that actually kind of links into this fascination with how the technology is seeing something and how we're seeing it differently. And different people would give quite different results for how grainy they thought the different shades of grey were.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I was doing first of all.
Well, that's one of the things that Jordan Peterson talks about a lot in his lectures, is the difficulty that they had with AI when they first started getting it to see.
Yes.
Because seeing is a much more complicated thing than we can imagine that it is.
Yes. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, they're still not very good at getting it to see. Yeah, but it's, yeah. So, but also actually in terms of the graininess, it's really interesting in terms of technology, because that old-fashioned film photography is making a comeback, because of course I always loved grainy film. I always loved the effect of the grain. Mm-hmm. And actually, so you've talked in your work about stochastic, the charms.
Stochastic resonance.
Yeah. So you can get an awful lot of value out of the grain, and so it's, I see my daughter's training to be an architect, so she loves doing film photography as well. There's things in it that you don't get from a digital photography.
Well, I actually am not looking forward to the day that, I mean, we have a digital TV, obviously, everybody does, but the ones now that are so fine grained, I don't even like looking at them. It's just, it's so pristine. There's no movement in it at all. So yes. I like fuzziness, a little bit of fuzziness. And I spend a lot of effort in my artwork to produce that kind of underlying texture, so that there is a kind of fuzziness, or it kind of makes your eye move a little bit when you're looking at it, so you don't get a real clear picture. It's really hard to do that, but yes. I spend a lot of work on that. So to just throw it all away and say, oh no, we're going to make everything shiny, it's like, I'm not going to like that.
And actually, in fact, I've got a funny story about the kind of relevant to that, which I'll tell you now, because I don't know if it would get around to it. A few years ago, I was invited to talk at the Mobile World Congress about AI and ethics. And the Mobile World Congress is held, I think, every year in Barcelona. It's absolutely enormous. It's huge. I think it's the world's biggest tech expo. So the whole of Barcelona is absolutely jam heaving. And it's like standardly you're expected to do a PowerPoint presentation. I don't necessarily do PowerPoints, but I kind of did one. And one of the points I wanted to make was how technology can drive our values in certain directions. So we can think that the things that technology can do must be better than what a human could do. But often it must be more perfect. But often we're doing things to a standard that we don't need, or is unnecessary. So in order to illustrate this, I put in my slides, I did a hand-drawn picture of a computer, like really rough and ready, just to illustrate this, because what I wanted to illustrate, a rough and ready hand drawing of a computer is sometimes all you need. It's good enough. And also it's got, the person do it, it's hand drawn. And I had to send my slides off in advance to the conference, because it was all so high tech. And there was like a few of us on to speak. And you should see the standards of PowerPoint slides. Can you imagine at this World Technology Congress? People had the most busy PowerPoint slides I've ever seen in my entire life. And then mine came on, it looked like hardly anything on each slide. And when I came to the point where I was going to make the point about technology, a computer-drawn picture isn't necessarily better. The technicians, they must have been aghast that there was this scrappy little drawing, and they deleted my slide, and they substituted a computer-drawn perfect picture of a computer.
Oh, no.
You obviously just couldn't bear the thought that this woman had done these really scrappy little slides. But it really illustrated my point.
Well, what on earth did you do if you're right in the middle of your talk and then that happens? I mean, what do you do?
I just used it. I used it to illustrate the point. I said, this slide
Oh,
isn't better than the one I've had. It's no better than the one I had, just because it's neater. It doesn't mean to say it's better, does it? So I used it
yeah,
to, yeah.
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 So you're working for the photography studio, and when did you make the decision that you were going to pursue further education? Was it
Um,
something about the photography studio that you were working in that
well,
gravitated your interest that way, or?
well, I kind of think, I just kind of think, you know what you're like when you're that age. I don't know what I was thinking really, but the person I was working with really encouraged me to go to university, and I think, you know, most people would have really. And I was still reading a lot of philosophy, so I went to I picked a university. I was unbelievably lucky with the university. I did undergraduate and then postgraduate. I went to do I went to do physics and philosophy at Keele University, which is a tiny university in the English Midlands, quite near Stoke-on-Trent. It had 2,500 students at the time. It was like a campus university built on an old estate. And I picked there because it had, again, most UK undergraduate degrees are quite specialist, but I wanted one that wasn't specialist. And they're mostly 3 years. So I picked one that had a 4-year course because I had a foundation year. The foundation year was fantastic because you had lectures from every single department in the university that you all had to go to. And then you had to pick different subjects, and you were forced to mix arts and sciences. And for the first year, for 2 main subjects you were not allowed to study anything you'd studied at school. So I had this fantastic year. I did philosophy and astronomy as my main subjects and lots of other stuff as well. And then over 4 years, I managed to stretch out to 5 years because I changed my main subjects as well. So all in all, I studied philosophy, physics, psychology, theology, computer science, and politics. It was fantastic. But the other thing I'd really again like to emphasize. So once you're in your main part of a degree, you did 2 principal subjects and 2 subsidiary subjects. And you, out of those 4 subjects, you had to do at least 1 science and at least 1 arts or social science. But for the 2 subsidiary subjects, because they wanted to encourage students to deliberately take subjects that they knew they were weak in, deliberately to stretch yourself, you had to pass, but it didn't make any difference to your final grade. What grade you got in your subsidiary subjects made no difference. So you could say maybe get the really top marks in your 2 main subjects and just scrape through. I mean, supposing you were a really good scientist and you thought probably good to learn German, but I'm not much good at languages. It wouldn't matter if you just scraped through in German. It's not going to mean that your overall degree is going to be any worse. I just think that was brilliant. I think it was brilliant because we were really encouraged to do things that we knew we weren't any good at. I just wish there was more education like that now.
I've never heard of such a thing. Well, I do remember. So I went to college during the hippie years.
Yeah.
So one of the things they instituted towards the end of my college career was no, just pass fail courses
Right.
without
Yeah.
grades.
Yes.
And I don't think that was particularly successful.
Mm.
And part of that is probably that there wasn't, I mean, part of what you're talking about that makes that sound more successful is that you do have an arena in which you must strive and compete and excel.
Yes.
But then you also have an arena which you're just looking at as an opportunity to learn something. And if you make everything just pass and fail, then our human nature kicks in and says, well, I just don't have to try that hard,
Yeah. Yeah, but which to be honest, it probably did for lots of students for their subsidiary subjects. But you did have to try a bit because if you failed, if you failed, you had to do another one the next year, and if you failed, you'd get kicked out. So you did have to try a bit. I did know somebody who was kicked out because he failed his French twice or something. But but you did have to. I just think it was a really good mixture because it was only a subsidiary, so it's only a small part. So they did things like they put on a special maths course for people who were kind of allergic to maths. So they designed it so that, they did, for example, some like history of mathematics and stuff. So you could, it was, people who had been so frightened, rigid of maths at school could have a go at doing some maths. It's a really good idea.
I did that with PE when I was in college. We had option. We didn't actually have to do the PE. We could take, kinesthetics, or we could take history of PE or something.
History of PE.
Yes.
Good idea.
Yep. One of my strongest memories coming out of that history of PE class was that the professor was the head of the PE department at the college. Right. And she was a little bit like that. I can't think of that actress's name, but she's tall and very sturdy, very slender. I just can't think of her name, and she's quite a well-known actress. This woman was like that, tall, very, very athletic, very sturdy. And she got on a rant one day about how PE teachers are just not admired, and that the rest of the professors think that they lack intellect. And she got into such a rant that she ended up on top of the desk, shaking her fist in the air about her academic credentials. I've never forgotten that one. It did not impress me with her academic credentials. Let's just put it that way.
What did you major in at college?
Well, I started out with a math major, but I pretty soon confronted, I never had the opportunity to take calculus in high school. And so when I confronted calculus in college, it was so different than what I had thought math was like, because up until you get to calculus, math is this beautiful, pristine thing that always works out. Yeah. Everything fits, and I really liked that about it. Then I hit calculus, and I was drinking too much and partying too much and not getting enough rest. And so the lectures just didn't make any sense to me, and ended up quitting that. And the other thing about math was that it was all men. I was one of the only women in the program. So I ended up switching to English and speech with an emphasis in drama and theater.
Yeah, it's interesting actually, because when I did physics, I did physics as a major for the first year, and it was almost all men there. And I think there were things it was like back in those days, but have really changed for women, I think, because I'm looking back, I now realised I swapped for physics for psychology because I just came to the conclusion I was really bad at physics. But what happened was, so there was a calculus class for physics, and I was the only girl in the class. And every time the teacher came to a step in the proof, he'd say, "Do you understand that, Paula?" And if I did, he'd carry on. And if I didn't, he would explain it. So I thought I was the worst person in the class. And likewise, in a lab class, there were two girls in the lab class, and the teacher would come up and say, "Oh, Lynn and Paula, how are you getting on?" And say, "Oh, look, you got A- last week. How did you manage that?" So again, I kind of thought that we were the worst in the class. And I got more and more and more depressed and just stopped going to physics, because I thought, I can't understand it. I can't understand it. And in the end, I got to see the senior tutor about if I could change subjects. And eventually, and he said, "You could only change subjects if you pass physics. You're not allowed to change subjects because you failed. So you got to take the physics exam," which was the following day. So I just ran home, and I don't know, I'll tell you the story. I just ran home and waited for my best friend to come back. And I said, "I've got to take the physics exam." And she fed me on toast and tea while I did a few hours revision. And I actually did pretty well. I did really well, but I was so demoralized, I gave it up. But now, to this day, I've always planned I'm going to go and do it back and do a physics degree. So I kind of thought, if I wait till the older I am, the more physics they'll know, so it'll be better value for money. But I always really regret that, actually.
I never took physics in college, and I look back on it now with immense regret, because it's one of the most fascinating things. I mean, I just eat it up now, but I don't have any background. I don't have any foundation for it, so I can only learn it at a very low resolution level, but lots of graininess. but I love it. So yeah. Yes, I think teachers have absolutely no idea what damage they do.
Yeah, yes.
When I was a sophomore in high school, my advisor, for some reason we all had advisors, I don't know, and it was a guy, And he said, you know, you're very intelligent. He said, you need to cover that up because it's going to make you unpopular, especially with the boys. So don't let people know what grades you get. You know, what were they thinking anyway?
Unbelievable. It's unbelievable. So actually, so I think it's a really important part of my background. My father always used to think that women could do anything. He used to say you could do anything you want in life, partly because, you know, he'd seen his mother, and yeah, and on my mother's side of a family, you know, they you know, they had a sort of tougher background. But so her grandmother was the first woman in Cardiff to have her own license to run a pub, and her sister ran a pub as well. And then during the Depression, when everybody was out of work, she had 6 children who needed jobs. So she started doing. The joke is always that the claim is that she invented the pub lunch, because pubs just used to sell beer, and she started doing lunches so that to give her children employment. So I don't know if that's true. She invented the pub lunch. Her sister claims that she did it. But anyhow, so it's just like that idea that idea of competent women, that you can just do things, and also not just, you know, look after your family as well. So I think that's kind of like really strong. But Dad always used to say that you know, you could do anything. You can do anything. My elder sister is a professional musician. She went to the Royal College of Music, and she was always really exceptionally talented. So, but luckily, you see, because that you get that kind of thing from people outside. But if you've got a strong background where somebody's telling you something else, it can you can kind of just plow on through it, I think.
So by this time you're in college, and you're now, so you graduated with a degree in philosophy and philosophy and psychology. And is that how you got into this? I noticed one of the things you do is something called ethnographic research with dementia patients. What does ethnographic mean?
Oh, right. Okay. So I work with people who do ethnographic work. So ethnography is it's kind of the sort of thing that anthropologists do when they go and hang around watching what people are doing. So it's qualitative social science research. So my colleagues. I've got some background training in social science research methods as well. It's just that I don't actually go out and do the research. I help with the analysis and of the data. So what my colleagues have been doing is they'll spend weeks at a time on hospital wards, just observing the care of the patients on the wards. So it's the kind of observations that the work that they do. There's different schools of ethnography, but the aim of it is to understand the meanings of the social interactions on the wards. It's called symbolic interactionism, is the school that they look at. So rather than doing things like, you know, counting how many times a certain thing happens or something, they're trying to understand the meanings of the interactions between the staff and the patients, or the different patients on the ward, to sort of get a really close understanding of what's going on. So by spending a lot of time there, you get to understand you know, get to understand the social world in quite a lot of detail. So that's what an ethnographer would do.
So specifically with dementia patients, the social interactions must be much more difficult to discern.
Yes.
Because you don't know really what's going on inside their heads because of dementia, right?
Yes, but actually, quite often it's looking at the failures of the communication, because very often what they've observed is that the patients living with dementia, that they do research on ordinary acute hospital wards, so they're not specialist dementia wards, but because people are living so long now, that means that more and more people are getting dementia because they're living long enough to be able to, you know, unfortunately develop dementia. So there's a wide range of capabilities amongst the patients that they're observing. So often it's just very mild and moderate. And often what happens is that the patient is trying to communicate, maybe needs a bit longer, or it could happen to anybody. If you suddenly became ill or broke your hip and ended up in a hospital ward, you could easily become a bit disoriented, and you've got to try to work out what's going on. So because of the fact that, and often a lot of the things that happen, a lot of things that kind of go wrong in the communication are because the staff are under huge pressure to keep up to the timetable, to record medicines and to deliver the meals and so on. Whereas for my colleagues who are doing the research have got all the time in the world just to observe exactly what's happening, and they can see things happening over the course of different shifts and observe patients over the course of several days or weeks. So that sometimes it's because the person can't communicate, but often it's because they're communicating really clearly, or they're communicating maybe in bodily language. So communicating in bodily language, for example, that they really need the toilet, or that they're distressed about something. So an example would be, so a particular example from their data would be of on the drugs round, on the medicines round. It's obviously really, really important to make certain people get the right medicines and that you record it all. That's obviously critically important. But so the patients are supposed to take their medicines, and there was an example of a patient who obviously just didn't want to take a certain medication, which is, you're right. Actually, everyone's got a right to refuse. You have a right to refuse medical treatment under UK law for any reason or for none. Anyone's got a right to refuse to take their medicine. But just kept on taking it, and the nurse was kept trying to make this patient take the medicine and thought they can't take it or they don't understand. And I guess kept on putting it down in the corner of their tray, taking it and putting it in the corner. So they were communicating, no, I'm not having that tablet. But it's interpreted as the person doesn't understand what's going on. So those are the kinds of things that, you know, the richness of the research and just diligently going sort of hour after hour, week after week, that's the kind of thing that my colleagues are able to uncover as to.
So I noticed in one of your articles, you said that there's actually some overlap. It seems an unusual thing for someone who's also involved in the ethics of AI to be doing both of those things, but you mentioned that there's actually some overlap between the two kinds of research. What do you see as that overlap?
Well, I think one of the, sometimes there's practical overlap. So one of the things that we hope to be doing is interlinking the work in looking at how technology might be used for assisting people. But there's overlap in terms of how it is that we're seeing people, how it is that you actually perceive a person. And of course, that comes really critically into looking at AI and into looking at technology. So one of the things that we're concerned about with the work with the people with dementia is how they're perceived as persons and what gets in the way of actually seeing them in their full humanity. So the hospitals, of course, are mandated. It's part of what we're trying to do is to achieve person-centered care. But of course, it doesn't necessarily, I mean, with everything that's going on with the hospitals, it's not always possible to achieve it fully. So we're looking at the sorts of things that get in the way. And I would actually add in terms of our work in this area, my colleagues they've never found a single instance of neglect or abuse. It's not to do with that. So I want to make it clear, because one of the things we're concerned about is the staff are under huge pressure as well. It's all the institutional factors and the timetables of award that's causing the problems. So the idea about how do we actually recognise personhood and humanity in another person? I mean, it happens. That's one of the central questions in artificial intelligence. One of the central questions we have to, well, it's linked in so many different ways, actually. So for ways in which technology is maybe interfering in how we see other people, how it's actually getting in the way of actually viewing people, but also how we might see AI as a person, how in effect how we interact with AI as if it was a person when maybe it isn't. And how we as people are being manipulated, really, how we're being manipulated by the technology around us. There's like, those are some of the things that I was trying to discuss with Jonathan Peugeot, and discussions always went all over the place because there's so much to discuss. But yeah, the basic idea of how it is that we perceive people, and actually that's been a central part of my work for a really long time, and there's a story around that as well, actually, which I'll. Do you want to hear the story around how I got to do for persons?
Yeah.
Because sometimes this stuff can get very abstract, and I think the stories kind of help. So yes, so like in a nutshell, after Keele, I went to Oxford. I went to Oxford to study philosophy. And by the way, actually, I just wanted to tell you, in case you were interested, I was unbelievably lucky. I went to at Oxford. The different colleges at Oxford are all again, people in North America might not be aware of this, because you have colleges in North American universities. I think it's a kind of slightly different system. But colleges at Oxford are all completely independent, self-governing institutions. But so the university is just a federation between independent colleges. And the college I went to, I just think it's like the best place in the entire world. I was so lucky. It was just fluke. It was Corpus Christi College, which is tiny. It's tiny. It's got about 280 students, 250 students. Absolutely tiny little place, founded in 1517. And it was just the most fantastic place. The most fantastic place to study. It was absolutely lovely to be there. And I thought I might mention it because some interesting history. It was founded by Bishop Fox to be a trilingual college with Greek, Latin and Hebrew, which is quite unusual. And they've got a big collection of really interesting medieval manuscripts. But Reynolds, who was one of the person credited with persuading King James to do a new translation of the Bible, was at Corpus Christi. So he was one of the people who did the King James translation, and part of the King James translation was actually undertaken at college. But the prophets were translated there. So it's kind of thing you didn't even notice at the time. So Reynolds is buried in the chapel, and there was always this massive old King James Bible in the chapel. You didn't take any notice of it. And like the Reynolds room, which is where part of the King James was translated, is like, we used to go for seminars there. One of my friends had her 21st birthday party there and wasn't used to drinking and was sick everywhere. It's kind of like, I kind of think which is kind of like fitting, because that kind of thing happens a lot in the Bible. But yeah, I just thought you might be interested in that, because it's like having that connection is just so lucky. It was just such a lovely place.
Now, the fox that founded Corpus Christi, was that the fox of Fox's Book of Martyrs?
I don't even know. It's terrible. It's terrible. I must look it up. I'll look it up and let you know. Yeah, it's quite a common name. I don't even know if that was. Yeah. Isn't it terrible? I don't even know that. I was studying modern philosophy. So that was my excuse.
So you were there working on your doctorate?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
At Oxford?
Yes. Yeah. And then my first job was in the philosophy department at Bristol University, and I had a friend there who was doing her PhD in psychology, and she was studying people who had mild learning disabilities, and she was interviewing them and doing a PhD on their experiences and their perception of life. And she was round at my place for a cup of tea, and she went off to the bathroom, and she didn't come back. I thought, she didn't come back. I was thinking, what's the polite thing? How long do you wait before you go to see if your friend's been taken ill? And she's still in the bathroom. And eventually she burst into the room, trembling with rage and shaking a copy of the Journal of Applied Philosophy that I'd left in the bathroom because I'd been reading it in the bath, opened at a page of an article by somebody discussing cases of marginal personhood. So philosophers have got a sort of a notion of what it is to be a person, which is expressed slightly differently, but an idea to be a person, you'd have to have a notion of self-awareness, you'd have to be rational, you'd have to have certain cognitive capacities, you'd have to have beliefs and desires, and to have a view of yourself in the future, and have to be recognized other persons, and so on and so forth. And so, a lot of people are quite familiar with this now, and a person is a different idea from a human being. So some persons might not be human. So maybe like aliens from another planet might be persons, or maybe chimpanzees are persons, perhaps some philosophers think. But also some human beings aren't persons. So this article was discussing cases of marginal personhood. So for example, people...
Sounds a little bit Nazi-like.
People with learning disabilities. So yeah, people with learning disabilities. So she was just shaking with rage, because we wrote a couple of articles following it after that, looking at how the philosopher's notion of what it is to be a person is if you look really closely at it, it's really skewed to particular notions of intelligence and particular notions of cognitive ability.
Yes.
As if cognitive capacity overrides, but there's other forms of intelligence as well. So override that, but also one of the things we wrote about was how different disciplines have got completely different approaches to it. So these philosophers would have a theory about what it is to be a person, and you'd hold this theory up against the world and see what fitted into the theory. And you might try to adjust it if she wanted something to fit in that didn't. But coming as a psychologist and approaching the people that she was interviewing for her PhD, would go with an assumption that here is a person. How can I discover that person? How can we relate? How can I find the person in another human who may have limited language, may have difficulty in relating to me? How can I? There's a person there to be discovered, and how can I find it? So it's I suppose you might call that. I mean, you could call that, if you wanted to be more theoretical, like a more phenomenological approach to sort of relating to the other person. But I just think that kind of like Tessa coming out of my bathroom trembling with rage was another really key.
Well, it also seems to me that she's approaching her epistemological adventures with an attitude of love, I guess.
Yes, precisely.
Yes, because I was in the legislature in Iowa back in the early 80s, and there were not very many women. Out of 100 legislators, I think there were 13 women, and I was one of the women. And out of 100 legislators, there were only 13 that had a conservative mindset, and I was one of those. I was the only one of the 13 women that had a conservative mindset.
Oh, wow, you had a great time.
I was a bit of an intersectional minority, let's put it that way. And one of the things I was responsible for was I was on an appropriations committee that did funding for some of the state hospitals. And there was another woman on the committee with me who actually was a Methodist pastor, I believe, when she wasn't working in the legislature. And she had a completely different idea of personhood than I did. Because when she and I took a tour of the state hospital for the profoundly handicapped, and these were mostly children, and they were children that were the kind of children that occupational therapists had to build specialized chairs for them because their bodies were tormented, and most of them had severe learning disabilities. And she and I both took that tour, and afterwards we're sitting in the cafeteria talking about it and what was the meaning of what we saw. And what she came away with was it would be better if they had never been born. This is one of the reasons that I'm in favor of abortion. And that was completely not the picture that I got, because the picture that I got was of the love and care of the caregivers there and how they were interacting with these children in a way of trying to find who they were inside of that shell and find their personhood and have a relationship with them. And the thought that they didn't deserve to have life simply because it's inconvenient or uncomfortable to look at them in their distress. I mean, I understood where she was coming from, I guess, but I was completely appalled. It's this, because there's this old book, which is, I don't think it's in print anymore, but it was actually, I think it was more of a monograph at the time, but it was actually published and available in the early 80s during this time. And it was called The Release of the Destruction of Life Devoid of Value. Have you ever heard of it?
I think I have, actually.
It was a book written by an ethicist in the kind of pre-Nazi era, when they were trying to decide what it means to be a person. Yes. And they came up with this, it sort of moves from this idea of everybody should be at least conscious. And if they're not conscious, so a conscious person should be able to make decisions for themselves. But if they're not conscious, then there needs to be somebody else to make decisions for them. And then if they're it eventually gets down to the point of like being subhuman. If you're mentally handicapped and you can't make decisions for yourself, somebody else. And if the decision is that you'd be better off not alive, then whoever's making this decision for this mentally handicapped person ought to be able to make the decision for them that their life is not worth living and that you ought to be able to do away with them. And this whole thing was set up. It kind of created the foundation for the Nazi move to start with the mental hospitals when they were experimenting with Zyklon B. Then they could go in and they could kill all the mentally handicapped to see whether or not the gas worked before they moved on to the Jews. So when you start talking like that certain people don't deserve to be alive or they're not really persons, it gets very scary very fast.
It does. It gets very, very scary, very, very,
Yeah.
very fast.
So I understand why she was shaking the book in the air.
Yes, and actually, so one of the things when I was at Bristol, actually, I was the first woman who ever worked in that philosophy department. Actually, I was the only woman there all the time I was there, and miles younger than anybody else. But it was a lovely, really nice department, and I taught practical ethics for a while, and I co-taught it with Adam, who was the head of department. And one of the books that we were teaching it from was a book by Peter Singer. Do you know Peter Singer's work?
I have heard of him mostly to his detriment.
So Peter Singer and Helga Kuser, they wrote a book called "Should the Baby Live," which is about questions like that, questions of difficult birth. And the students pointed out to us that Adam and I, in front of a class, we would kind of like forget what we were doing and accidentally refer to it as the pet name we called it, because between us we just used to call it "Kill the Baby," because that always seemed to be the answer. It always seemed to be the answer. So yes, it does make. I mean, actually, so what I think, so one of the reasons why, one of the other things that happened at school. So I think, I mean, in terms of your colleague you went with, I think we also had to think about what might make somebody end up with that kind of attitude. And so that I think, I don't want to sort of take credit for myself that I was like concerned about this. It was one of the things, again, one of the influential things at school, that Dad and the head teacher had come up with a scheme for woodwork classes, but instead of making a little kind of bookcase or something to take home to Mum and Dad, they teamed up with some schools for profoundly handicapped children and would make specially designed, so that the kids in woodwork class would make specially designed toys and equipment for children with multiple disabilities. So for example, there was a little boy who needed a specially designed crutch, but he was going to have to wait 6 months for it to be made. And then one of the kids at school made it, and he had it the following week. So that was always something that I was kind of aware of and really admired. But interestingly, this is something else I was thinking about in terms of education. The school went through lots of changes, and one of the ideas of choice in education came through. So the idea that you should be able to choose and lots of different options. So that completely upset all the teaching of the handicrafts, so that people would do a term of this, a term of this, a term of this, a term of this. So the number of people who were just taking woodwork or metalwork or whatever, and then building up skills over a number of years, just really, really decreased, because because of choice was so important. So you need perseverance, you need time to build it up. And so that scheme just fell by the wayside, because there weren't enough pupils taking work for long enough to be able to do it. Which is something else that had always really impressed.
And I tell you about my daughter, and my daughter's a millennial, I guess. She said the people of her generation think it's just appalling that shop and home ec and things like that aren't available in high school, because high school is all about grades. You got to push, get into the best colleges, blah, blah, blah. And it's driving kids into depression and anxiety, and when they really ought to be learning how to take care of themselves, manage a budget. I mean, like when I was in junior high school, we had to learn how to sew, how to cook, how to do minimal handicrafts. So by the time I was a young person, I was able to go out and help. I mean, we retrofitted a number of houses and remodeled houses, and we did all the work ourselves because you had to. You couldn't afford to hire it, right?
It's interesting because actually, so my daughter's a little bit younger than yours. She's 23, and the school that she went to was terribly competitive, because we were living in Oxford then, and she was going to a school with, like, her friends had parents who were kind of like staggeringly high achieving, lots of corporate lawyers, and there are more parents who are Nobel Prize winners per square inch. So it was really, really high pressure, and she suffered really badly from that. She used to get really anxious despite my best efforts to prevent her. And then one day she had a breakthrough one day when she found out that some of her friends were on anti-anxiety medication because they were so worried about their exams, and she just said, "It's not worth it, mummy. It's just not worth it. It's just terrible the pressures people are under to perform."
Mhm.
So counterproductive.
Well, I'm glad she had that breakthrough. Yeah.
Anyhow, yeah. So actually, I was looking at the time. I don't know how long you were planning to talk, because there's other things that we wanted to talk about, but we haven't got onto it all yet.
Yes, well, we should get on to them. I usually go for about an hour and a half, if that's convenient for you. Yeah, so we've got half an hour or so. So what did you want to move on to?
Well, actually, so I suppose there's more we could talk about. There's a lot more we could talk about with the AI, but we were going to talk about that strange typo in your email and what that.
Oh, yes, yes. So go ahead. That was really interesting.
Yeah, it's really, it's because it happened. It seemed like we ought to talk about it somehow. Do you think?
So when I invited you to speak, I said, okay, so let's do this on April 28th.
Yes, yeah.
I have no idea why I did that, because I mean, I know that it was June when I wrote it, but I knew that July was the following month, obviously. Hopefully I know that. So I don't know how I got that April 28th, but that triggered in you a memory of something that happened on April 28th in the past.
Yes,
And it was a very painful memory.
Yes. So that's why I felt I had to mention to you, because it just seemed so odd that you suddenly put April the 28th, because I knew you meant July. So April the 28th, 1996 is the date of an absolutely terrible mass shooting in Port Arthur in Tasmania, where 35 people were shot dead. It was like one of the worst mass shootings, or maybe the worst mass shooting there's ever been in Australia. And I was on holiday there at the time. I used to live in Australia, and we were on holiday, and were sort of caught up in the aftermath. Kind of narrowly missed it. Narrowly missed being at the epicenter of where everything happened. And so April the 28th is a date that kind of like really leaps out at me. And so I just felt as if I had to tell you the response that I'd had about it, because it seemed so odd that you'd made that strange slip. Random slip. So it kind of seemed, well, maybe this is something that we need to talk about. So,
well, is there some way in which that experience changed you afterwards?
Yes, it did. It did. So I've been thinking. Well, I've obviously thought about it an awful lot. So I was also thinking about it in terms of it, because your channel's called the Meaning Code. So you're looking at meaning. So one of the things that I really wrestled with is how on earth can you take meaning out of something like that, especially out of something like that where I was just, in a sense, a bystander, and so I was with my husband and my 2-year-old son, and we all survived. We were all fine. So in a sense, it seemed almost as if you have to try to find meaning out of something so terrible, but I had no right to find meaning out of something where I'd survived and others hadn't. So 35 people lost their lives. I don't know how many other people were injured. Children died. So I really have struggled. I've really struggled with that. But I can sort of like briefly go through the story and sort of and talk about my journey about trying to find meaning out of that. Mm-hmm. Because it might also, because maybe it might also help other people, because other people have had similar experiences, or maybe had the experience of, there's a sense, I mean, there's a name for it, isn't there? Survivor guilt, about thinking that how terrible it is that you survived and other people didn't, which has just really hung over me. And actually maybe, so this year's the 25th anniversary. I had planned to go back to Australia for the 25th anniversary, but of course, nobody can go in or out of Australia at the moment because of a lockdown. So maybe talking to you on this channel is. But also, one of the first things I'd like to say, because I felt so awful about it, because I just felt so awful about even thinking about it in terms of me, because of the people who died. just always think about the people who lost their lives and all the people who still live there, all the locals who were so affected, and anybody on holiday. And in particular, I'll fill in our particular story in a minute, but there's one particular woman who I'd found who was shot dead at the wheel of her car. And by any faint chance, any of her family or friends are listening, I'd just kind of like them to know that I always remember her. So I kind of don't want to make this about me. I just want to kind of talk about it in case it's of use to anybody else.
Mm-hmm.
So briefly, what happened is, so one of the really incongruous things about this is that Port Arthur is an exquisitely beautiful part of the world. It's kind of like, as you'll know, Tasmania is kind of like Australia's an island, and Tasmania is an island like hanging on the bottom of Australia, and then Port Arthur is kind of like right down at the bottom of Tasmania. So it's funny, when we flew into Tasmania, I really had the sense that we are somehow clinging to the bottom of the world. Okay, I know the world is actually round, but you kind of get the sense that you're clinging to the bottom of the world. It's kind of really, really remote. And we went down. Port Arthur is the historic site of an old prison where some of the sort of worst convicts were sent. So it's like this really, really incongruous site of real fantastic beauty, lots of little inlets, beautiful waterways, and beautiful forests. It's like a lot of Tasmania is temperate rainforest. It's exquisitely beautiful, actually. And there was this prison. So the architecture for prison is rather nice, like stone, but a site of unbelievable cruelty. So the convicts, I mean, a lot of the convicts had done, well, I mean, you could get hanged for sodomy, for example, but a lot of the convicts had done pretty trivial things by today's standards and were treated with unbelievable cruelty, really terrible cruelty. And so we were staying in a little cabin, and had gone out in the morning. I bought a raincoat, and it's one of the reasons why we missed being at the site where the shooting happened was because I took so long deciding whether to get blue or turquoise raincoat. And then we had lunch, and then we sort of had an argument. We had an argument about whether to walk or to drive, because we were going to go down and look around the historic site. And we decided to drive in the end, and we drove and stopped. There's a little garage, like a cafe general store. We stopped to get some milk, because we needed some more milk. And Henry stopped the car, and I went up to try to get into the shop. The shop was a little way from the road. And the sign said it should have been opened. It was a Sunday. But the door was shut. People inside, they wouldn't let us in. So I tried to get in, and they wouldn't let us in. So I thought, what's going on? So then gave up and got back in the car and went to drive off. And I looked to my left as we were turning left. And there was another car parked there. And there was a woman just slumped in the front passenger seat. And so I got out, and I stood there, and I knew something weird was happening, because there were all these people in a shop, and there's somebody in a car. You can't see any other car, but there's any sign of an accident. Where's the ambulance? Why are people hiding in the shop? So your brain is telling you this is wrong. So I went over. She looked in a really bad way, but I went over to see if I could do CPR or if she was still alive. And then a woman had come out of a shop by this time and had crawled up and said to us that there's a gunman on the loose and she's been shot, and we were to go back to the shop and hide. So we sort of drove back up to the shop, and then I had to get my son out of the back. So it's funny, even now I'm like quite calm, but as I talk about it, I'm kind of reliving it. I had to get my son out of the back of, his awful car seats, because it was a hire car and the buckles are really terrible. So what had actually happened was that the gunman had actually left by then. He'd driven north along the road, and then shortly afterwards we'd driven south down along the same road. So we'd come back. So we'd missed him. So he wasn't there, but we didn't know that. I just thought it was somehow focused on this post office. And I remember looking at all the trees and thinking, any second now, I'm going to get shot. So I was struggling to undo these awful, the car seat, the buckles are so difficult to undo. I have no idea. It might have taken me half a second. It might and carry Reuben into the shop and hide into this flimsy little shop. So we were there for about 2.5 hours. I suppose there were about a dozen of them in this little shop hiding, and then not really knowing what was going on. There was very little communication. So of course, no mobile phones, no internet or anything in those days. And actually, one of the really weird things that had happened about that, the reason why they wouldn't let me in the shop when I tried to get in the shop, the gunman had got long blonde hair. So the people in the shop had seen him take a man hostage and shoot his woman, and then drive off with the man in the boot of his car. And then a little while later, another car comes back down, driven by a man with long blonde hair. So it was out in the country. So the bloke who ran the shop, I believe, went to get his gun from the back of a shop, thinking this is the gunman coming back. But the reason why he didn't shoot, because he then noticed that there was a woman in the front passenger seat. Well, the second man with a long blonde hair wasn't the same man. It was my husband. He also happened to have long blonde hair, and the woman sitting in the front seat was me. And if I hadn't been there, they never have seen that Ruben was in the back seat. So that's why they wouldn't let me in shop, because they thought I was with the gunman. So it's like when I try to I can't process it. I had this thing. Well, of course I can understand why they didn't let me in the shop, but they thought I was with a murderer. I just can't process. I cannot process that. I can understand why they didn't let me in the shop. They must have thought it was a trick or something, but it's just like really, really weird, because there aren't all that many men with long blonde hair. So it's just like this ghastly coincidence. So, and then after a couple of hours, the Bush Fire Brigade came along and told us that we had to go down to the main site. There was a hotel on the main site, and we went into the hotel, like the bar was already full. There were people in the dining room. Just bizarre, this bizarre scene with the hotel staff were giving out pumpkin soup and sandwiches, and we just all hung around waiting to find out what's going on. And it wasn't until the 6 o'clock news came on. The police tried to stop us watching the news, but we just all glued to the news, because we had no idea how many people had been killed. And we had to stay overnight. We weren't allowed back because our cabin, but the gunner was still, the police knew where he was actually, but they didn't tell us. So he was already kind of like under siege in a bed and breakfast further up. But we just thought he was somewhere around, so we just didn't know, because it's a little wooded area. We knew he wouldn't be able to get back to Hobart because it was a little peninsula, so they could block off the road, but we didn't know where he was. So, but the next day after they'd caught him, we were allowed to go back to our cabin and collect our stuff, and we just drove out of the place. So, but then what happened before that was that, I mean, it's bizarre. It was so bizarre being in this hotel dining room and just like drinking tea and drinking pumpkin soup with this people in shock and chaos. And I remember seeing someone sort of like, ordinary like middle-aged, middle-class lady pulling up her blouse, because she was showing somebody the scrape on her ribs with a bullet that had just grazed her ribs because it just missed her. But then when the news came on, I suddenly realised that I'd told my colleagues where I was working that we were going to Port Arthur, and I suddenly realised that they would be hearing this on the news and would be worrying about me. So I went out to the phone box to ring. I didn't have, you have to remember that nobody had mobiles, and we had to queue up for an old payphone. And one of my colleagues, I could remember her phone number because it was like a really simple phone number. So I queued up to ring her. But I'm sorry, it's too much detail, but this stuff all comes back. So you couldn't put money in anymore because it was full up. So I had to ask, can I do a reverse charge call? And I can remember thinking, oh, maybe she won't accept a reverse charge call. Maybe she won't want to pay for it. Of course, they were all really, really worried about me. So I just rang and said, oh, we're all fine. We're all safe. And then, then what happened next? I'm gonna have to try. I hope I don't start crying actually, because she then said, thank God, because I'd heard on the news that a 3-year-old had been shot, and I was frightened it was Ruben. And thank goodness it's not. Thank God it's not Ruben. And I just went completely silent. I was just like in utter horror and shock because it was somebody else's child.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It was just somebody else's child. So I just think about it. But just had like a kind of just sort of a visceral. I can't even put it into words. This visceral appreciation. This visceral appreciation of kind of like, how can I put it? Anything I say is going to be too feeble. Of the equality of all life, but like, of course, how could I couldn't say I wasn't glad, but we were fine. But I couldn't say that. It's just so terrible. It's just so terrible.
Yeah, it's one of those things that's too hard. It's too hard to think about, much less too hard to articulate.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so I mean, I was actually quite traumatized by all this. And, you know, professionals who I've seen have said that trauma is always worse if you're worried about your child's safety as well, if you have a child with you, because it like kind of magnifies it all. I mean, it's funny actually, because people sort of think that you're frightened. During the time it's happened, there's no fear. It's just complete and utter focus. So when I was like trying to get Ruben into the shop, trying to get him out of the car to get him into the shop to hide, I didn't feel afraid. I had this thought, I'm going to get shot at any second, but that's like more, I've got to completely focus on this task. It was completely 150% focus on what I was doing. But it's only afterwards that you feel, frightened. So then I had this kind of task, how to try to make sense of this, and feeling it's not up to me. So people talk about, could you forgive him? It's not up to me to forgive the person, because he didn't do anything to me apart from like scare me. It's other people. I always in my mind felt of him as a sort of natural phenomena. I just kind of thought this is just something that's happened. I didn't kind of feel anything towards him. I didn't feel anything towards him really. Although I did have this one really scary dream where all that happened in the dream was that he and I were just alone together in a room, and he was just standing there like a few feet away looking at me. And in the dream, it was like he was trying to like psychologically get the upper hand. He was trying to have something over me. And all I had to do in the dream was like kind of use my willpower to stop him kind of getting one over on me. So in the dream, I kind of like had to use all my willpower, but I wasn't going to be one of his victims. It's like a bit hard to explain, but it was really frightening. But I kind of like, I had to summon every bit of willpower not to give in to this person. So I remember a really good friend of mine, we were at college together in Oxford, had said to me, and I know that she was being loving and really trying to be helpful. She said, there must be a reason why you survived. There must be a reason. Which again, I couldn't really think of that in those terms, because then you have to think there's a reason why other people didn't. But I kind of came to the conclusion I had to kind of force some meaning out of this, because you have to, even if there's none, you have to kind of make your own meaning out of it. But something, I mean, something really, I can't think of a word. Sorry, I'm getting more and more inarticulate. When your brain experiences trauma, it doesn't make any kind of rational sense. So what happened to me, because I'd found a woman who was dead inside a car, for me, I became traumatized around road traffic. It was nothing to do with road, but I became like I was on red alert for any car accidents or traffic accidents. And whenever I was at a traffic, I was always like thinking there might be an accident. And I just became completely obsessed with the idea that the research shows that in a situation like that, only a minority of people actually retain the capacity to sort of like actually act in a sensible manner. So that when people say to me, I mean, understandably, you must have wished you'd never gone to Port Arthur. But I can honestly say I never wished that. I would always have these ludicrous fantasies that we'd managed to arrive in time to run him over, or I'd managed to sneak up behind. My fantasies were all about being the person who managed to kill the gunman to stop him. And I know I couldn't have done it, but I only ever wished that I would have been able to, been somewhere different and to save somebody. So I just became kind of like a bit obsessed with, would I be useless if something like that happened? I mean, who knows? Because nobody knows. Anyway, so about 6 months later, I used to cycle into work. So Canberra's a big stretched out city, and lots of cycle paths. I used to cycle into work, and one morning cycling into work, I got up. There's a main road into Canberra, and a cycle path crosses a main road. And I was just cycling up to the main road just in time to see an accident. So a cyclist who was coming the other way was hit straight on by a car and thrown. He must have been thrown up into the air, must have thrown about 10 meters and just landed flat on his back. So because I'd been so like on red alert, and so I've got to be able to help, I flung myself on my bike and then raced over to this man he had a helmet on. He was just been flat on his back to see how he was. Now, but where we were, the ambulance station for that part of town was visible. It was actually on Northbourne Avenue, is the name of the road, and it was about 100 meters, 200 meters down. And there were people standing outside. They'd seen the accident, and so somebody had a phone and was calling it. They could see the accident, and people were waving at them. So all they had to do was just drive back up the wrong side of the road. So there was help. I mean, like 2 minutes away. But another man who was on the other side of the road had got to the injured cyclist before me, and he was saying, "We have to take his helmet off." I said, "No, don't take his helmet off," because I've done first aid training, and all I could remember is his helmet might be holding his head together. Don't move him. So he said, "We have to see if he's still breathing." So he's still breathing. You could see his chest was rising and forward. He was still breathing. And then he said, "Now we have to get into recovery position." I said, "No, don't move him. Don't move him." And actually, only about a week before, a friend had been just talking about how people who have spinal injuries, a large proportion of the injuries, of serious injuries or deaths, are caused by being moved at the time of accident. You mustn't move them. And actually, so I'm thinking in terms of what I took from what happened to me at Port Arthur, and the feeling that I was going to be useless. What I did in that situation, I always felt bad that I was shouting in front of the victim, because you're supposed to stay calm, aren't you? Said to stay calm. I had to stop this man. And the man was like, I used to dress for work. I used to dress for work like in jeans and a like t-shirt, and I kind of like looked like nobody. And he was a man going off cameras for seat of government. He was like a civil servant, a briefcase, posh suit, and all the rest of it, and quite authoritative. And I had to pit my authority against his. And he said to me, he said, "I have done a first aid course, you know." But I said, "So have I." So I just had to like stop him from moving this man. And then the ambulance arrived, and of course they get out the special inflatables to move him, you know. And then I just went off into work. And so, in terms of like getting any meaning out of that, so then what I did afterwards, a little while later, I rang up the hospital to see if I could find out how the man was. And of course, they don't give out any information because it's confidential. And it was never reported in the papers. They won't give out any information. So what I did was a bit naughty, really. I rang up the police, because we haven't got high standards. So the police told me what had happened to him. And he'd broken his spine in 2 places. He was still alive, but he'd broken his spine in 2 places. So that I know this other man was acting with good intention, but if I hadn't stopped him from moving him, he might have been killed, actually, or he might have been much more severely injured. Mm-hmm. So, but then in terms of my obsession with, like, you have to do something, in a sense, I did nothing, because in that situation, the correct thing to do was absolutely nothing. Sometimes the correct thing to do is absolutely nothing. But what I did have to do was to learn how to assert my authority over somebody else. So,
well, and I mean, in the very first event, to be willing to move over into the situation where you were available to assert your authority, right? I mean, that you had to take that step instead of, I think there's a huge tendency when you've been traumatized to avoid the situation, because of the fear of being helpless or making a mistake or all of that, right? So you overcame that natural fear and you moved into a place where you could be of some assistance, which I think that shows that all the time you were thinking about it, even though you were obsessing with how could I have changed things? How could I have been instrumental in stopping it? I mean, that's always, that is the thought that used to always go through my mind whenever anything terrible happened. Like, I remember, especially during the Kuwaiti War, for some reason, I got obsessed with thinking it was, and this isn't exactly right, but it was sort of like, it's my fault. And that, I know that can almost sound like psychotic or something, but it wasn't so much it was my fault as I felt some need to justify myself in this face of all these other people being slaughtered.
Yes.
I had to find some reason that I wasn't in that situation and I wasn't in that country and I wasn't, so it was like, then I'll take the fault on myself.
Yes.
was the way that I would justify it to myself.
Yes.
But it took me a long time to realize what I was really doing was putting myself in the place of God, and that that wasn't helping anybody because I can't accomplish anything to change it, right?
Yeah.
So but you worked out a way to find your wheelhouse, I guess would be the way I would put it. You found your wheelhouse in that situation where you could actually be of some assistance.
Yeah, but I also think, I don't like, so what, after that happened, actually that was my kind of like feelings of trauma actually really decreased significantly. Also, I kind of think if I hadn't been at Port Arthur, none of that might have happened. I might not have sort of forced myself across the road. I might not have been so assertive. None of that might have happened. So I kind of think, oh, the gunman, because of you, that chap's life was saved. No. So that's kind of. So I can't credit it. And it's interesting when you say I could really relate to what you were saying about Q8 when you were saying you're putting yourself in the situation of God. That's a kind of similar to the thought I had when I kind of realised that what had to be done in that situation was nothing. Was just nothing. Mm-hmm. That's what you could do is nothing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I think this is one of the things with the whole the idea of combinatorial explosion is that every event has so many subsequent consequences that none of us have any idea about, right?
Yes.
I've thought about this a lot because of my husband leaving me when we were missionaries in Japan, and he left me, and I had a grown daughter at the time. I came back to the United States. I later got married and had a baby at the age of 46. And I always think about how that daughter, who is now 26 years old, wouldn't exist if that other thing hadn't happened.
Yeah.
And that's very mysterious, really.
Yes. Yeah.
But there's probably a lot of other things came out of that. I mean, there's the whole trajectory of my life changed because that happened, and all the things that I got involved in, and all the things that I learned subsequently, and all the people whose lives I interacted with. And so that just, even my little life just spans out over all these directions because of that one event that happened in my life. And I think I've told this story before, but on the day that my 26-year-old daughter was born, the OBGYN who delivered her, he looked at me and he said, as he's delivering her, he said, "Do you realize that every child born impacts world history?"
He said that, did he?
He said that to me, yeah. And so I thought about that a lot.
Yeah. Wow.
This child is going to impact world history. We may not be able to see how. It may just be that she crosses the street at a certain time on a given day that keeps somebody else from driving through that intersection.
Yes.
That makes them late for some meeting, that, and it all catapults out. And so the very idea actually that AI can calculate all the possibilities.
I know.
I mean, you talked before about this documentary that was made about the guy that won the AI that won the Go tournament.
Yes.
What's the name of that? It's DeepMind was the company that built the AI, but what's the name of the documentary?
I think it's just called AlphaGo.
AlphaGo, yeah, AlphaGo.
Yeah.
That was theoretically, the idea was that the computer could see all of the potential moves that could be made, 150 moves out into the future, and that's why it eventually won. But the game it lost because his opponent made what looked to be a mistake, right?
Yes.
It looked like a mistake. Everybody looked at it and they said, well, that's a mistake. Why did he do that? He knew better than that. But our lives are made up of that. Our lives are made up of these mistakes, accidents, anomalies, weird circumstances that change the trajectory of everything.
Yes. Yes, yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? And of course, the Go board is an unbelievable number of different combinations and possible games, but like it's this size. It's like, look at the world. It's like you could probably get 1,000 Go boards in this room. It's just, it's just, and it's all neat. Yeah. So there's no way with life that you could plan anything out like you couldn't have planned anything out like that. You couldn't have planned.
They think so, though.
Yeah.
I was in preparation for our conversation today. I was reading a précis online of a book written by Yuval Noah Harari, who's another guy kind of like Peter Singer, right?
Yeah.
In terms of his perspective on ethics, and I'm just going to read a little bit of it, and I think you'll enjoy this.
Which of his books is it?
What's the name of the book? AI and Decision Making, 21 Lessons for the 21st Century.
I haven't read that one.
The article that's kind of a foreshortening of the book is called AI and Decision Making, Shifting from Free Will to Technology. So he's talking about how although free will feels free, it really is just a biochemical response. It's not really freedom. It's just all biochemical. So he says, this biochemical process meant to promote your safety and well-being, which we call free will, has historically been a perfectly valid method of making decisions and running democracies. However, science has developed technology that not only replicates that process, but also performs it better than you can. As people shift authority from free will to computer algorithms, liberalism becomes increasingly obsolete. Now, what he means by liberalism is he's not speaking politically. He's speaking about, freedom of choice and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
People have already delegated some tasks to algorithms. You let Netflix suggest your next movie. Google Maps tells you where and when to turn. But each decision that algorithms make has two effects. First, your trust in the algorithm increases. That's certainly true, right?
Well, unless it goes wrong.
Yeah. Whenever it gets it right. Most of the time it'll get it right. So most of the time your trust will increase. You'll not only gain trust in Google Maps, but you'll lose trust in your own abilities. That's certainly happened with me with the whole GPS thing. Number two, the algorithm learns more about your preferences, which enables it to make even better decisions for you in the future. As the algorithm gains more knowledge about you, it will make better choices for you, which will reinforce your increasing trust in its decision-making. As long as algorithms make better choices on average than humans do, they'll still be considered a better alternative. Then he goes on to talking about how to make this even better, we can start wearing biometric sensors so that the algorithm will know how our body is reacting to certain decisions, and then it can make even better decisions for us. And I'm thinking, already Facebook is narrowing us down into this little cognitive dissonant hole that we get into because we're getting all of our preferences just the way we want them. Yes. And he's talking about making it even more so by us wearing biometric sensors, as if that's a good thing.
Yes, but also
I was appalled.
It's completely appalling. I sometimes wonder with his work whether he really means it or if he's just doing provocative, like pot boilers to make a whole load of money. Actually, I haven't got a very high opinion of him, but I mean, one of the things that's going on there is the idea that he's talking as if we are all these little separate things and we have preferences and they're just trying to work out what the preferences are. But what's happening is that our preferences are being molded by the technology. So even like take the Netflix and say, oh, as the algorithm's better, you trust it. Well, if the algorithm is suggesting you watch certain sorts of films, then, well, I suppose if you don't watch them, you stop halfway through, it'll stop. But if it's suggesting you watch certain sorts of films, you might then actually become the sort of person who only watch rom-coms or like particular sorts, or maybe they'll be suggesting films, or the suggestion they only recommend like films made in America, English language films, or you might get one that's sort of, so then they think, oh, you're never going to be exposed to any foreign language films, for example, or it's going to be changing your preferences. It's the idea that it's a ludicrous idea, but we're little islands completely unaffected, not just by another person, but by technology, which is like pushing and pulling us all over the place. When they say that, but when this technology is deliberately designed to be persuasive, it's deliberately designed to nudge us in certain ways. It's not designed to seek out exactly what our preferences are. It's designed to manipulate. It's designed to put preferences in there and manipulate them in order to make us do stuff so they can make money.
Well, and designed to create an addiction in us so that we have to do more and more and more of that.
Yeah.
And so that we don't end up doing whatever it is that we might have done if we had run into some roadblocks in our preferences and had to make different decisions, right?
Yes. Yeah. And so the Google Maps thing is interesting. The sat nav thing is interesting as well, because you were saying until it's better than you are yourselves. But your people's capacity to follow directions is getting worse because of following Google Maps all the time. It's getting worse. So it's not saying it's better than humans are. It's better than humans have become because of what's happened to them. So and actually, this drives me. I've never had a car, and I tend to walk everywhere, especially since lockdown. I live in an area of London where it's really, really easy to walk all over the place. And I really like maps, so I really like following maps, and I kind of like just have a sense of this is north and that's west, and are you south or north of the river, so you can work out where you are. But one of the things I've noticed, like a really dear old friend came to visit me 2 or 3 weeks ago, and she hadn't been to this place before, and I realised what she was doing. She was using me as if I'm sat nav. So she just kept saying, oh, do I turn right here? She kept on ringing me up or messaging me all the time she was coming, because she was thinking I was going to be, oh, turn right here. It's like, what's going on? Why don't you get out a map and follow the map? Did you do geography at school? So anyway, so the idea that it's just becoming better for humans, but also gets back to the point I made earlier on, talking about that little hand-drawn picture of a computer. Better by what standards? Why does everything have to be? So technology's got its own sorts of values. I mean, like efficiency, for instance, and speed and so on. But we don't always want those. You don't always want everything to be as fast as possible, or I mean, yeah. Or even, I mean, sometimes it's sometimes like so. For example, if you're in the old days when there was like one television in a house and like 3 channels, and somebody else insisted on watching the channel and you missed your program, that was annoying. But it did sometimes mean that you were forced to watch a program you wouldn't otherwise have watched and maybe learn something, rather than being handed to. So it's really easy to sound like some sort of old old moaning about the days.
I mean, if I had never heard Jordan Peterson speak, just that one thing, I would never have gotten interested in physics and certainly would have never gotten interested in evolutionary psychology and a lot of these topics that he talks about.
Yeah.
But in order to try to understand his main thesis, I've had to look at a lot of different things. And in order to see how his main thesis kind of fits in with the way that I see the world, I've had to explore a lot of different avenues.
Yes.
And which brings me back to the question of how on earth did you ever end up on Jonathan Pageau's program?
Oh, right. Okay.
I mean, you're off. You're teaching philosophy and the data ethics and ethics of AI and all of these things, and working in the ethnography of studying dementia patients and all of those things. And Jonathan Pageau, what was the connection?
Okay, so I think I first heard Jonathan talk with Jordan with that Pepe the Frog thing a while ago, and then it was actually just before must have been just before Christmas last year. This is actually a suggestion that came up on YouTube. I think it was suggested. He did an interview with Tom Holland. Have you read Tom? Have you read Tom Holland's book on Dominion?
I have not, but I've heard a lot about it because Paul Vanderklay talks about it a lot. So
Yeah, it's a really interesting book. So I'd read the book. Because I live in London, I'd heard Tom Holland speak about it actually, and so I'd watched several interviews with him, and so I think that meant that the interview with Jonathan Peugeot came up as a suggestion. So I listened to it, but I listened to another Jonathan Peugeot video, and I kind of found I really found a way that he talks about things seemed to make a really a lot of sense. So I listened to lots of his stuff. I was really interested, for example, a lot of the stuff that he talks about. So he's done some videos looking at but the sort of presentation of the female hero getting, you know, a way that's all corrupted actually, like making the female a masculine kind of hero.
yes,
Actually, maybe that was something that particularly triggered me because of course of what my experience was. I'd always like kind of wanted to be a hero because of that business. But then I was particularly interested in a lot of the stuff that he talked about the margins, because of course about how that related to a lot of the work that I'd done with people with learning disabilities and in the work with people with dementia. So that a lot of the stuff really made a lot of sense. And actually, there's one video where he was talking about there's a bit, I can't remember where I first came across this, but I'd always been really interested about stuff about not mixing linen and wool and having margins at the end of your fields. I'd always been interested in that kind of stuff. I can't remember why. And then anyway, just before Christmas, I just sent it on his little contact form on his website. I just said, oh, I've been really enjoying your videos and how useful it was thinking about it with a lot of my work. Because I was thinking about how I've been thinking a lot about how people with dementia on hospital wards are kind of pushed into this really, really super marginal position where they shouldn't really be. It was just really useful to think about it. So anyway, so to my surprise, he emailed back, and I'd mentioned I was doing work in AI as well. So that's how I ended up on his channel. But I do find the way in which it's interesting. I think one of the ways, just a really basic fundamental way in which he thinks about things that I found really interesting and I felt that I could relate to is, and I think it probably, I don't no idea because I'm just speculating, to the way in which he does art and craft work as well, is the necessity to look both at the little detail and then go back to the big picture and then back to the detail and see how it fits into the whole. So because that's something that you have to do, you have to do. So for example, when I'm trying to teach ethics or thinking about the ethics, you have to look at particular things that's going on, pay attention to the individual, but you do have to step back and see how it fits into a bigger whole and just keep on iteratively doing that process. So I kind of think that's one of the ways in which I found the way in which you approach things.
Well, you know, I would love to explore this with you in the future if you have time for another conversation, because you had mentioned that you have done some artwork and would like to share that and talk about some of how that fits in with your work. And I think we could have a very productive conversation about creativity. But we've been going for about an hour and 40 right now. So I think maybe it's a good time to kind of wrap up and think about a future opportunity.
Yeah, I'd love to do that. Yeah, because I hope I haven't been to like talking in too much detail or going on, because there are some things so I had some artwork ready to show you actually. Some of which I'd picked out because of stuff that I thought it would be interesting to compare and sort of talk about some of the work that you've done. So yeah, I would love to do that.
Okay, well, let's make a date. Maybe in a couple of weeks we'll get together again and.
Yeah, that would be good. Yeah, a couple of weeks would be good. So I'm really excited for next week. I'm seeing my son for the first time since before the pandemic because he lives in the Netherlands, so I haven't been able to see him.
Oh,
so,
wow!
Doing next week. So
that's going to be really great.
It'll be really great.
My older daughter lives only about an hour from me, but during the first 9 months or so, we never hugged or anything. And then we finally just decided, you know what? Everybody's trying to be careful. So let's just be careful and get together once in a while anyway. So we started doing that. But I mean, it was a pretty amazing day, the first day that we got together after 9 months. So yeah, it's going to be great.
Well, I've so enjoyed talking to you. I hope I haven't, I always feel I've talked too much. I really enjoyed talking to you.
Oh, I think there's meaning in every minute of it. So I have enjoyed it too. So thank you so much, Paula. And I look forward to our next get together. We're going to talk about art.
Yes, brilliant.
That'll-
I'd love. Yeah.
Cool. See you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye.